Okay.
Right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to one of our Belmas lunchtime talks. It's great to see you all, and great that this can go on our YouTube channel and on our website to be recorded for those of you who are in other time zones and will be watching this later on. So I was really delighted to be able to invite both Gemma Moss and Alice Bradbury to come and give this talk today, because I heard a slightly different version of this talk at our New Visions in Education group, and I thought, wow, this needs to come to the wider Belmas audience. So I'm really delighted that both Gemma and Alice have accepted our invitation to do one of these lunchtime sessions. So for those of you who haven't met Professor Gemma Moss before, Gemma is Professor of Literacy and Director of the International Literacy Centre at the Institute of Education in the Learning and Leadership area, so in the Centre for Education Leadership. And Alice Bradbury is Professor of Sociology of Education and Equity at the UCL Institute of Education. And I think you're still co-director, Alice, of the Helen Hamlin Centre for Pedagogy with 0 to 11s. So we're really delighted that both Gemma and Alice have joined us this morning, or this afternoon now, and look forward to hearing what they've got to say. Thank you, Gemma.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, Deborah, and welcome everybody to this session. I and Alice are going to share presenting. Our topic is on the slides. We're talking about the challenges facing primary education in England, mostly, but we think what we're talking about has relevance elsewhere. This is an overview of what we're hoping to cover. Both Alice and I worked together during COVID to look at what primary schools were doing and how they were responding during periods of school closure. Alice has carried on researching what schools are doing in the midst of a cost of living crisis, which is creating huge problems for many of our poorer communities. Then we're going to think about why it is that the education system in England so ignores the social dimension to education. And we're going to conclude by thinking about tactics and targets. What can researchers do to make things different? So, Alice, over to you.
Thank you, Gemma, and again, thank you for the invitation to do this talk today. So we are going to start by thinking about this idea of polycrisis, because we're using this to start to analyse what we think is happening in these challenging times, as we said in the title, during in education in England. And this may also obviously be applicable to many other contexts as well. So starting off with polycrisis, this is an idea which has been around for a little while, but particularly has been kind of come to the fore in the last few years to describe a situation where you get multiple crises at the same time, hence the word. Lawrence's definition is one that's commonly used, this idea of crises in multiple global systems which become causally entangled in ways that significantly degrade humanity's prospects. And we'll come back in a moment maybe to that last phrase. So it's defined really the idea of polycrisis, the idea of not only are lots of things happening at the same time or very soon after each other, but also that they begin to interact in unexpected ways, and also that then they sometimes make each other worse, this idea of amplification. And as you'll see, we're using this idea to think about the education system and the multiple different challenges that schools are facing at the same time, and the way in which they interact with each other. There is also this quote from Tooze, which I think is quite helpful in kind of emphasizing the problem of a polycrisis, because it's about threatening our identity. It begins to question what the purposes are of things like schools, for example. And he may also makes this point about the fact that it's not just there are lots going on, but it becomes to be more overwhelming than the sum of its parts. And I think that that's what we're trying to really get at when we talk about polycrisis in education, is that there becomes too many things going on all at the same time. People use it in usually to think about kind of geopolitics, to think about climate change, COVID, economic recessions, all these kind of bigger questions. But we think this is a really useful concept to think about what's going on in education. Thank you. So what I have here is a kind of symbol, and I could add a lot more circles here if I wanted to. So the blue things are the kind of bigger outside things that have been going on, the long-term effects of COVID, the cost of living crisis, related increased child poverty, and then this longer term impact of austerity in and the kind of reduction of the welfare state. All of those things are making a big difference to schools, with a kind of rising social need, and also at the same time a retreating welfare state. At the same time, that one please, Gemma. The red ones are the things happening in schools. So we've had a lot of discussion, continued issues about assessment, particularly a lot of discussion about Ofsted and the pressure that schools are under. There's also a teacher recruitment and retention crisis, huge problems within the workforce and including in leadership. And then also in primary education, we've had a pretty intense period of policy change over the last sort of 15 years, with huge amounts of new policy and kind of all coming at once often and creating a sort of storm of policy at the same time. So schools are coping with this poly crisis, which is poly in the sense of many crises coming from outside, but also many things happening within the education sector. And I could add more red boxes there about the SEND crisis, for example, about budgets, so on. In different contexts, people would put different things at the top, but there are a number of different challenges going on all at the same time, and then they're starting to interact with each other and make each other worse. We might say, oh, you know, perhaps they're not degrading humanities prospects, like in Lawrence's definition, but certainly there is this, you know, there's certainly the child poverty is reducing life expectancy and so on. So there are, you know, bigger consequences to consider. So we have been investigating some of these sort of topics to do with schools and their wider responsibilities really since the very beginning of the kind of COVID period. Gemma was very efficient and hot off the heels as soon as the COVID crisis hit and the school shut at getting funding. And we did these two projects for the ESRC. The first one in 2020, which we started in May 2020, which was kind of right at the very beginning, called A Duty of Care and a Duty to Teach. And that was really trying to explore those kind of tensions between the responsibilities of schools at the time. That was a big survey and then interviews and so on. And then we followed it up with another one called Learning Through Disruption in 2021, obviously following the second lockdown, and where we looked in a much more focused way at particular schools through case studies of 7 different schools. And again, we interviewed everybody within that kind of context of these different schools. I then followed it up, as Gemma said, with a project afterwards funded by BERA on food banks in schools. I've also done one about food banks in nurseries as well, but I'm just using schools today. And that again is case studies, 6 primary schools who run food banks, and where we interviewed
Alice seems to have dropped out. We'll see if she can. You just dropped out, Alice.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Sorry about that. So yes, we're putting together data from all of these projects in order to try to explore some of these questions about the challenging times for primary. Thank you. Right. So one of the key things we want to emphasise is how much all of our data from all of these projects really shows how schools are very much locally embedded. And sorry, we are talking about primary schools. But I should be very clear. Primary schools in all of these projects. So primary schools during COVID, as you will remember, the news stories were providing for families in so many different ways, delivering food, helping with housing and transport and so on, helping with home learning and giving out laptops and all of this kind of many kind of local needs that they were responding to. And we argue that really there was the motivation for this was that there was no one else really to support. The joined up welfare state has declined so much after 10 years of austerity, and that there was a feeling that if we don't do this, then who will? So this moral purpose, this kind of feeling of responsibility, which is not recognised by the state as what the school should be doing, was felt very strongly by the teachers within the system, and they felt that they had to step in. the schools are also absolute experts in their local community, and in many cases they have a lot of knowledge about what communities need and how to support those families. And so they act on that knowledge and use what they can to help them in the best way possible. So they're very well placed to help as well. But what we're seeing really is this polycrisis hitting them from multiple directions. They're having, well beyond COVID, increased levels of need, and also at the same time reduced budgets. So a reduced need to pay for the kind of provision that they need in order to support their community. So I've got some data here to illustrate this point about how schools' responses were driven by these local needs. So we did a large survey through TeacherTapp in 2020. And when we asked teachers about priorities, 72% of them said that we are checking how families are coping in terms of mental health, welfare and food. So that was the top priority. And when we looked by free school meals, again, obviously that was even higher in areas with higher free school meals. So we definitely could see right from the start that there was a difference in how schools were responding, but they were prioritising that kind of checking in on families. And this was really shown also in our case studies when we learned a lot about how each school knew its local community and then responded and adapted its provision to that local community and its needs. So at school 2, for example, there was a very large local employer which shut down because of COVID. And that really changed the local financial situation amongst parents. Previously, there'd been a lot of jobs, even if they were quite low paid, they were in jobs. But because the large local employer shut down, all the kind of connected services stopped as well. And as this head teacher said, those jobs just imploded. They were on temporary contracts, they're not permanent. And suddenly there was this huge financial strain on this local community. And the contrast is with other schools where those sort of things just didn't happen. The local employment market stayed the same. So the school was having to respond to all of these families who weren't on free school meals, hadn't needed support before, but suddenly they had to because of the COVID crisis. So obviously after COVID comes the cost of living crisis, and that is obviously began, you know, the two kind of seeded into each other, didn't they? So there's a huge kind of overlap. And we found even in the Learning Through Disruption project that schools were doing an awful lot around food and children's free school meals, but also family food were becoming more and more important. So this head at school 5, for example, is talking about signposting families to food banks and so on, and how much he knew that because of the COVID experience, how much higher need there was in the community than she had ever previously appreciated. So she says that we're enabling us to know our community in different ways, in more meaningful ways, and probably more accurate ways. So actually they gained an awful lot of information during the process, which would help them afterwards. And then I think there's one more quote here. This is from one of the food bank schools where the head is talking about how the families that they engage with in their community would really struggle to go somewhere else to get a food bank voucher.
She's dropped out again, and she is in the IOE actually. That's a great shame. You back, Alice?
Yeah, I can hear you. Sorry.
You've just dropped out again. Never mind. Okay.
Do you want to carry on?
Else?
Yeah,
carry on. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah, but just one back. So this is just that quote on a previous slide. It's just about how the family wouldn't access food in other ways, but they were able to access the food from the school because they don't have the shame or the judgment. There's no stigma attached to it. So they know the families really well, and they can say, come and get some help in a way that other services aren't able to help. So this leads to all these interesting questions about who is responsible for helping families. Is it the school's job? What does that kind of mean in terms of the role of schools within the system? And what we found was because of this incredible knowledge and this really kind of being embedded in the local community, they were very well placed to help families often. So Sarah here is from the local community at Twining Primary. she's the welfare officer. She knows so much about the local area and the local housing. And she just knows what families needs. And so that means she's able to sort with things. So they run a food bank, but they also give out household goods like rugs and things. And she knows who needs what because of what kind of flats they're in and so on. So she's got this incredible a sort of sense of the nuances of the local community. We also see examples here like the fact school being described as a safe haven. So they're the institution that families trust in a way that other institutions aren't. And also Grace here is saying that actually the COVID experience really helped them build up this sort of culture of trust, and that helped when the cost of living crisis came along, because the families realised that the school was, you know, on their side, and they'd been successful during COVID, so therefore they were going to keep helping them during the cost of living crisis.
Sorry, I think I jumped.
Yeah. Thank you. So, but there are tensions, and I think, I mean, all of this is written about in my book on food banks and schools. It's a lot more complicated, but I think that it is worth saying that although schools have stepped into this role, there are real tensions and real sort of, I think, issues that we would all have with schools just unquestionably stepping into this role. And the teachers we interviewed were quite reflective about those tensions. Here, that one of the heads is saying, you know, it's our place to teach. Once this crisis is over, then maybe, she's talking about stopping the food bank. But it's not just the cost of living crisis, it's housing, social care, it's teaching. So this withdrawal of all of these other services is making such a big difference to the levels of need that the school is seeing. It's not just what happens in the school and education policy. I'm happy to do it and I enjoy doing it, but it's not acceptable. So they understand the moral kind of consequences. It makes me really sad that we have to. So again, it's no one is sort of saying this is a brilliant system, even though the food bank works really well. And then what we see here is, just to kind of sum up, is a kind of gap, we argue, between the policy and the reality. So there is a bit of a policy void about what families should do, what schools should do about families in poverty and in food insecurity. Schools aren't advised on what to do, but they are stepping in and doing this stuff anyway. So there is this kind of positive side to this, that schools are taking action, having agency, and using their knowledge to work effectively. But of course, this shouldn't blind us to the significant underlying causes of these crises, particularly child poverty. We can't let the goodwill of staff obscure that a fundamental problem. And there's a real risk, therefore, that we kind of let those wider policies go unchallenged. So just to kind of sum up from this section, Gemma's moving me on, so I probably talked too long. But thinking about this in terms of multiple crises, I think helps us to kind of shine a light on the roles of schools, but also to think about where they are placed within the modern welfare state. And I think what we're also leading to, which Gemma is going to kind of expand upon, is the idea that we need to research in real time those closest to the problems in order to really understand what needs to be done, what kind of policy needs to be made. Because unfortunately, if we just limit ourselves to what policymakers decide is important, we might miss some of the really important knowledge that we see in local communities and particularly in schools. And I hand over to Gemma.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to pick up where Alice left off, but also ask a slightly different question, which is, why is it that policy is ignoring the crisis that teachers every day see coming into their school and are reacting to? Why isn't there the same moral imperative in policy as there is on the ground? And I'm very struck by, we've had a change of government. We now have a Labour government in. They are going to come up with a child poverty strategy. And Bridget Phillipson, when she arrived at the Department of Education, made two things abundantly clear were her priorities. One is standards, and the other is the word thrive. She wants pupils to thrive. How does policy, however, put those two together? Thriving is obviously part of what's schools are really helping pupils do when they provide them with food, when families struggle to meet their basic needs. but that is often put in tension point with the accountability and standards agenda. And our view is that the accountability and standards agenda is part of the key problem. Now, one of the things about the standards agenda in the UK is that it has a particular kind of characteristic. We're not like very many other places because we do have a high stakes accountability system. There are an increasing number of points in pupils' career where they are tested and where the consequences of the test really matters for schools. And if schools show really poor pupil performance, that can run into a negative Ofsted judgment. That's the inspectorate. If the inspectorate decides they're not doing the job the inspectorate thinks they should be doing, which largely revolves around test performance, then the school itself can be in trouble and it can end up being taken over by another multi-academy trust. So we've got a high stakes accountability system, but it's combined with what Toby Greeney calls high autonomy at the school level. So we have a whole variety of different kinds of schools competing for pupil share, for business share, for how many schools they will run. Very marketized in terms of its orientation to the business models that are being deployed. And this is leading to a quite confusing situation, which is raising a whole other set of problems really about who knows what, who values what. And in none of the high stakes accountability, high autonomy, quasi-market system that we run is any value given to the kind of school-based knowledge that Alice just described. So knowing a lot about your community, understanding their needs is not part of what Ofsted asks you about, or indeed will give you any credit for. Indeed, there's quite a lot of suspicion within the school system still that anybody who does talk about community needs is going to use poverty as an excuse for poor performance. So pupil premium funding, for instance, is tied to, can you demonstrate that you're using it in combination with the best advice from the Education Endowment Foundation, that's EAF for those from abroad, on how to improve pupil attainment. So every question in education comes back to questions about attainment, and questions about attainment exclude questions about the social value of education. And they also create a kind of crazy system in which this is a visual I've borrowed from Patrick Wall from EdPolNet. He reckons there are about 300 education service providers at this point in time who are trying to fuel the attainment outcomes from the system primarily, rather than fix the social problems. All right, and they're doing so in different ways, and it produces a very chaotic market in advice to schools, practically none of which ends up as being advice about how to efficiently run a food bank or when and under what conditions you should. So what it's leading to is really huge gaps in system knowledge. And that's what I'm arguing. Now, back in the day under New Labour, I think New Labour ran an invest and direct strategy. At the time that they ran the national strategies to change pedagogy in the primary school, they used the strategies to invest in teacher knowledge, to invest in the school system. They were rebuilding schools. They were doing a whole load of stuff. They thought that the prescription that they'd given primary schools about how to change pedagogy in the classroom would improve attainment. And unfortunately, they never really hit the target that they'd set themselves. That left them politically vulnerable to, and New Labour left government with the Tories able to say the national strategies have been a mistake. The national strategies have been an error. They've not hit their targets. Interestingly, a Tory government, which is using a very different approach I'm calling outsource and control, has somehow managed to leave government with their approach to education largely intact. So when Bridget Phillipson comes in, She says standards, and by standards she means the knowledge-rich curriculum and all of the things that the Tory government has done to raise standards and close gaps. The trouble is that I think what is happening, and again, this is why I call the current system outsource and control, where the new Labour government could be held to account for the prescription that they've given the education system. This is how we'll raise attainment. We're going to do it like this. Oops, hang on a minute. It's not quite working. Oh dear, it's us that's carrying the responsibility for this. Under the Tory government and the system we now run, nobody really holds the responsibility. The responsibility has been devolved to the 300 people who are in the system. And if one set of prescriptions to solve the attainment crisis doesn't work, you subcontract. You just throw out one supplier and you bring in somebody else. And it doesn't look as if the government itself has made the mistake. You're putting the responsibility down in the system. So what we get in the English system at the moment is that schools can be judged as requires improvement or inadequate. And what will happen is that a new multi-academy trust will be asked to take them over. So this multi-academy trust can't fix this school. This head can't fix this school. We'll change the supplier. In fact, what then happens is in the system is that those schools who are most vulnerable to takeover are ending up being serially taken over by somebody else. So the assumption that somebody new coming in will make a difference to this school means that we're never getting to grips with the social problems within the community in which the school is sitting, and which might lead to very different kind of prescriptions for upping attainment than those that are on offer from this proliferation of knowledge brokers operating in the system. One of the other peculiar characteristics of the system that we've got at the moment is, and I think this is on my next slide. No, it's not. Okay, my next slide is just showing you it's not working. I'll get back to that at the moment. But I think what we've got is a kind of churn in prescription. This will fix your attainment, that will fix your attainment, let's do something else. And because we've now got a market in suppliers, it means there's an inundation of knowledge circulating faster and faster around the system, actually to very little effect. And that is my slide. All right, because this is the official statistics of what's happened between 2010 and 2023, reproduced in the curriculum assessment review interim report, which shows that pretty much the disadvantage gaps, that's the gap between children on free school meals and other children, is remained pretty much constant throughout the period. Okay, there's a gap in COVID and various things happened around the tests at that time, but if I think back to the New Labour period, New Labour increased performance at Key Stage 2 from around about 53% to just short of 80. Under the Tories, we have never had a similar increase. We're kind of plateauing, really. We have not had significant increase in attainment. And look at this. I'm going to show you another graph. This is from the Children's Commissioner's Office analysis of statistical data, and it's showing that if you look at GCSE results, there is an absolutely direct relationship between the number of times that children move house during their school career and what the outcome is in relation to attainment. In other words, that the social factors that impact on children's education do so independently of anything that the school does. All right. Obviously, it's the poorest students who are most likely to find themselves serially in temporary accommodation and then get moved on with no regard to where their local school is. And that kind of churn is absolutely to their educational detriment. So attainment gaps in a knowledge-rich curriculum are what the system obsesses about. And what it ignores is the cost of running the system this way. My complaint about a knowledge-rich curriculum is we've now got to a point where people have started backward mapping from what people need to know at university to be able to undertake a maths degree, therefore what they need to know in A-level, therefore what they need to know at 16 in our GCSEs, therefore what they need to know at 11. And if you backward map all the way down, we can start saying what 3-year-olds should be doing to enable them to reach a threshold which won't appear until 18 years old. Actually, what this means is, number one, we've taken out of primary education any understanding of child development, because all we're talking about is education as a curriculum sequence. Sorry, you've got to do this now. I don't care that you're only 3. You need to know this so that by the time you're 5, you can do this. That strikes me as very bizarre, actually. I mean, who really thinks a 3-year-old is interchangeable with an 18-year-old or an 11-year-old? This simply isn't the case. And actually, summer birthday data consistently tells us this, because summer birthday children always do worse. And that's not because they're less good than other students. It's because they're on a different developmental trajectory. Okay. One of the other perverse consequences of running a knowledge-rich curriculum is that actually those kids who aren't keeping up with the pace of development of their peers get marooned in what I'm calling a pedagogy of repetition and catch-up interventions. So rather than being kept on board with a rich curriculum, they're actually getting stuck in a silo, a dead-end silo, where they end up endlessly repeating. So kids who don't pass our phonics screening test aged 5 have to retake it age 6. If they don't get it at 6, they have to retake it age 7. Think of the opportunity cost. I'm going to use that expression deliberately, borrowed from economics. That means they're being denied the opportunity to learn other things because, I'm sorry, you can't learn anything else unless you've got through this particular gateway. So what we've created is a curriculum of gateways, which are actually working against inclusion, and I would argue are highly likely to be part of the absolute rise in SEND, because we have children who cannot cope with the kind of pace to the curriculum such as it is, and are quite unnecessarily being penalised. Think about if we wrote child development back into the primary school curriculum. Think about if we encouraged project work rather than thought of subject silos in the primary school curriculum. Think about if we thought about the 20% of the kids who fail the phonics screening check age 5. I think it is 5, not 6. I'm waiting for Alice to tell me so. It is not the key determinant. If that 20% never get back, okay, they do not subsequently get to the same level as the kids who pass the first time round. There always are going to be fewer of them who are going to have got through that particular hoop. Why aren't we thinking about other ways of teaching them? So we're creating the problem around SEND, mental health, and I also would say persistent absence, because a lot of kids are just, and their parents are actually no longer seeing that school is offering them anything, and therefore they're stepping out. All of this would be changed if we actually recalibrated what we think we value in education, and in particular decided that education has a social value for the people in it. One of the key things that children learn in primary schools, guess what, is how to make friends, break friends, remake friends, how to socialize with each other, how to work in groups. Those are all things that come out of a rich curriculum designed for primary school children, rather than a subject knowledge rich curriculum, which actually for many of them just simply counts them out. So this is my big beef. What are we going to do about this, and why is it so resistant to change? There are policy consultations going on. This is new with the Labour government. What Tory government ever asked anybody anything? They would sit in a room with their group of experts. They might ask their favoured experts what they thought, but they wouldn't open up for consultations. There are consultations going on, but what is really happening around them? Several of us on this call may well have given testimony to the interim curriculum review. The interim curriculum review has made very clear that actually it's about subject choice at GCSE. That's our 16-year-olds exams and A-level. and it is not really taking seriously what should the primary curriculum look like. So it has literally 2 paragraphs on the primary school curriculum in a 44-page report. And all it's really saying is there enough breadth in the numbers of subjects studied? So there has been a lot of us have put into the interim curriculum review, unlike the Big Listen, which is a consultation run by Ofsted, our inspectorate. The interim curriculum review has not published a summary of what was submitted to them. And the interim curriculum review only quotes the survey they conducted with parents and teachers. That's a survey where they've designed the questions to elicit the kinds of answers they are looking for. So the broad submissions that went into the curriculum review have never been reported on. I know the NEU is trying to pursue this with a freedom of information request, and they've been denied at the moment. Are there things that we can do about this? What about if we created an alternative submission hub and got everybody's submissions that we've made individually and as organisations together and put them out? Because we own the submissions, why shouldn't we share them? So that's me thinking, is this the right target? Is this the right tactic? We need much clearer evaluations of system failures. If we look at the Education Endowment Foundation, that's EAF, it's championing of evidence-based practice. It's actually running with what I'm calling a market and self-defined best practice, where the market says, this is my little idea about how to address attendance. You send text messages to parents every week saying, why isn't your child in school? And that will change their behaviour. That has absolutely no evidence base sitting underneath it to say that it works, and yet it achieves the same sanction in the system as something that's come through EAF. If you look at EAF and its toolkit, it actually has a very closed set of questions that it asks about and evidence that it collects, and almost all of them are to do with improvements in attainment, and they're not looking at the social determinants of educational progress, nor talking about how to address them. Interestingly enough, up in Scotland, they do this quite differently. So looking at Scottish advice on attendance, one of the things that they do is actually draw in Bronfenbrenner's ecological model. I'm drawing a circle in case people on this call understand what it is. It puts the child in the center, then it thinks about the micro, the meso, the macro context in which they're in, and it asks schools, where do you cite the problem of attendance for this child? Where therefore do you need to invest to bring this child back into school? Now, there are problems with the Scottish system because it presumes that the school can somehow manage this and do it on its own. Actually, the kind of system organisation, reorganisation, I think will work in the interests of equality, would mean government doing something about the accountability system that we run with and its perverse effects. It would mean challenging the groupthink, and I am calling it groupthink, that runs right the way across the accountability system, makes the knowledge-rich curriculum the be-all and the end-all, and something that can't be challenged. So I'm going to stop because I think it is time I stopped pretty much. And you'll have read the slide in terms of other areas I'm thinking about where, as researchers, we might be able to intervene, but where we also might be able to work with others in the domain. And that's just telling you I'm doing a lot of work on this at the moment, which you don't really need to know. And I'm going to leave us with some points for discussion. So those are my points for discussion. I know we're a relatively small audience, Deborah.
Yeah, we are a relatively small audience, but we know from our data tracking that people watch us online afterwards. And if you're happy to have the discussion recorded, people will be just as interested in that as well. So
and for anybody who is watching this from abroad, I do think it's worth thinking, is this same dynamic going on where you are, or does the policy dynamic look very different? What is the role of the researcher in exploring that policy dynamic? in your context, and what can we all do to try and shift things for what I would call the public good? Because I do think that researchers have as much of a moral imperative to act as the head teachers in the data set that Alice was talking to. Okay,
lovely, and that's a brilliant note to end the presentation on, Gemma. Thanks very much. I've taken a screenshot of your points for discussion, so if you want to turn the slideshow off, then we can just move to talking about things. We have been putting things in the chat while the two of you have both been talking.
Oh, yes, you've been very busy.
And Emma's, given that we're a small audience, and Emma's posted up the latest NGA talk as well, research that's been done, survey report that's been done. Emma, do you just want to talk about that for a minute?
Oh, I really think I shouldn't, because I'm now the former CEO of NGA. That feels like I'm impersonating, and I haven't left my old job behind, which I promise you I have. But just very, very quick word from the time I was there. The questions were being asked. I can't remember the first year we did it, but for the sake of argument, I think it was just before COVID. So we had a comparator. So I think it might have been 2019, but we were asking schools what they were doing to support families through a whole range of things, so including food banks and others, and it completely chimes, which is good. It wouldn't be great if we were telling you see, I'm still saying we, and it's been almost a whole year. If that set of surveys was telling a different story from yours, but it fits beautifully. So yeah, I just thought if people hadn't had a chance to see that, it might be worth it. But seeing as I've got the microphone, can I make two quick?
Do. Yeah. And also, in your defence, Emma, you were there a very long time. Right? So it takes a while to kind of deinstitutionalise.
Yeah, exactly. I started the series off, and it's now 15 years, so it's lovely that we've got all that longitudinal. Anyway, thank you both, Alice, Gemma. That was really really helpful and covers ground that I've been thinking about as well. So I'll make one point which is a bit techie, and then make the much more important point. I was really interested to hear about how you categorized, Gemma, what was in the sector and what was outside, as it were, the outsourcing. So I think one of the things that would be a difference of opinion on is the fact, well, this is the argument, is that actually maths are simply school groups. So therefore, they aren't an outsource, they are the system, except that obviously we've got parallel sets of school structures. So that would be the bit I think that I would refine, how I think about it, that they are absolutely part of the system, and that we can't keep thinking of, our education institutions as always being, single site schools. Schools is more.
Do you want me to reply to that, Emma?
Sorry?
You want me to reply to that? It sounds like you're
coming on. Should we do that?
Let me be quite specific. All right. I don't have any objection to maths in principle. What it does allow, though, it's the change in the relation of policymakers to the system. If you were New Labour, you took responsibility for the things you were doing to try and improve system performance. And they got by that because they could not ever quite hit the target. And there's a political trajectory to that. They basically got ambushed by Nick Gibbs, who won the right at ballot. He literally drew the shortest straw and was able to define teaching of early reading as the subject for the Education Select Committee, and with enthusiasm for phonics managed on the back of that to rubbish what the strategies were doing. So it was a political ambush at policy making level. If you look at what the Tories did subsequently, I think the biggest lesson they learned from that is that if they showed that they directly controlled system improvement, it would rebound on them. So it's they who have outsourced. They have outsourced the problem of system improvement to other players. Now, what that means is that actually you can then serially subcontract. So teaching hubs opened up, attendance hubs were opened up by Zahawi at the end of COVID, because the Children's Commissioner had drawn attention to the huge rise in absence. I think they've now been disbanded. Teach First has been doing Job X. It's about to have its contract put up to open tender. If we think about ITE, the role of universities in supplying teacher education has basically been outsourced from them to the school sector. So it's not that I think MATs are bad actors by virtue of being MATs. Some of them are very good actors. You know, if I think of the Fed, they're doing a heck of a lot of work to try and change the policy conversation. But the trouble is that it means there is really no control. There is no controlling mind clarifying what they're doing in the system. And what strikes me as particularly paradoxical is, on the one hand, the system likes to trumpet that it's evidence-based. And that's why it gives so much importance to what Eve says, and also what Ofsted says. Think about the writing framework not written, it must have been written by a civil servant. It has no author on it. It has a cherry pick from the evidence base to say this is what we want to do. And so at the same time, I mean, I've got a lovely example of a teaching school near me, a teaching research school, which is doing a fantastic job with a colleague in UCL. Absolutely wonderful. There are others who are just kind of repeating the knowledge-rich curriculum mantras as if they are the things that everybody should know. There's no quality control, in essence, on what goes around the system, but too much push from the powerful players, Eve, Ofsted, that actually you've got to sing our song. So that, for me, is the irony about outsource and control. The government steps out of being responsible for anything, and actually it doesn't leave the system with a proper reflective structures that would enable us all to have a more intelligent conversation about what kind of knowledge architecture do we really need to be able to function well and learn well. And too many questions on that then go missing. That's my beef with it.
Thank you. There's so much there to talk about, but I'm really conscious we've got a tiny amount of time and other people want to come in. So if I could just very quickly make my other point, which is much more about the disadvantage issue and where schools are in society. So I completely agree with you about EEF and the narrowness of what they look at. And I had a real go because I used to work in the child poverty sector. So I worked for CPAG for a long time, for example. And I tried to join up my two worlds. So we held a round table with, it was when Kevin Collins was chief executive of EEF, of trying to bring together those, the wider discussion. There was some in fact, academics involved as well from the child poverty world. And I was really, really disappointed that nothing came of that discussion. So one extra thing I'd throw in, because I think your analysis is all spot on all of that, is that the MAT movement, headed by CS2, are doing a really good job of trying to argue that MATs are the civic organisations, whereas actually in that case, I think it is the individual schools working community. I think you were saying that, weren't you, Alice, about, that schools being so embedded in your community, and that's what we took as well at NGA. And I think there's something there to the language has been captured, and it's been captured wrongly. So in fact, there's lots of schools, and indeed in some cases this is where local governance comes in, who really, really do care about those community issues that you were talking about, but they're sort of getting lost in the bigger discussion. But thank you, Deborah, for allowing me the floor.
Very welcome. There is another research project that I would like to do at some point. I'm doing one on rebrokering schools at the moment, the impact it's having on education leaders, about the amount our schools are actually being utilised now for their communities. Because my local knowledge base, which is quite big across pretty much the whole of the East Midlands, tells me that at least in this part of the country, our schools are not used by their communities anywhere near as much as they used to be. And I've spoken to several MAT CEOs who've said, well, it's a financial thing. We end up paying more to allow communities to use them. So in my local area, it was actually a standalone trust, not a multi-academy trust school, that said, a band had been rehearsing in that school for 25 years. And they said, well, these are the fees you need to pay us for like the caretaker locking up and the cleaning that needed to be done afterwards, band couldn't do it. So the band went to a different standalone trust in a different location when it had been part of that school and part of the wider community for a quarter of a century. And that's just one example of, you know, thousands, literally, anecdotally, that I've heard across the system. So there's lots and lots and lots of different directions that we could talk in. Alice, is there anything you want to add? Because I'm then going to come to Lara to give us a little bit of an international dimension.
No, go ahead. That'd be interesting to hear what Lara says.
Yeah, Lara, over to you, really. So you might want to just tell people to start off with your own context, and then some international observations for us would be great. Thank you.
So Gemma said at the end of her presentation about the international context and like how we could reflect about that. So I'm from Brazil, and I'm like trying to see how this fits into the Latin American context in general. And so when both of you were speaking, I could see our present and our future. Like, because our present is exactly what Alice presented. So Alice, it shocked me actually that most of the things that we saw in Brazil and in Latin America, because we did a lot of research about COVID in Brazil, and I was involved in other research and other projects in Latin America in general. What you discussed and what you showed us as results are mostly the same as what we saw in Brazil and what we saw in Latin America. So that the schools had this moral compromise of like, well, like in Brazil, it was even harder because we didn't have state support at all, right? So the schools had this mission and this thing that this moral leadership that you said, that you mentioned, that we should do something. Like we need to do something. These kids need support, and we are going to do that. So we saw a lot of cases. We interviewed 100 principals during COVID in Brazil, and we saw that many of them were like personally involved and personally they had this mission, like this mission where they went to the students' houses to deliver the activities in the families that where the students didn't have internet connection or something like that. So many of the things that you said about the food banks and everything, it was also our situation. So my question to you would be just the context is pretty much the same, and we are also facing like a polycrisis situation in Latin America as we are in the world, right? But I think that maybe this is a question of a percentage. Like, what is the percentage of schools that are vulnerable in the English context and in the UK, like more broadly? And like, what are the percentage of schools that are considered vulnerable in Brazil or in Latin America? So I think like just having a quick reaction to what you said, this maybe is one of the things that might differentiate us. But like many of the things that you said resonate with our situation. So, and I also saw the future because what Gemma said and also what Emma brought to the conversation too about the multi-academy trusts and about all this system reform and everything. This is exactly, we are in this turning point in Brazil and in Latin America, where we are seeing this as the solution for a system that is considered broken, right? It is not. We have a lot of states and municipalities that are very good, that are working. So they found a way inside the state to do that. So they didn't need a private funder or anything like that. We also do have a lot of NGOs and actors. So that illustration was very interesting to see. But I also would like to hear like the cautions that we as researchers would need to take, and what could be our role when we are in the beginning of this change. So these are my two questions for you both. I don't know about the timing. I'm sorry if I talked too much, but I just wanted to react. It was very interesting. Thank you one more time.
Thanks, Laura. That's a really great and really helpful contribution to make us realise that we are very, very, very far from being alone in struggling with our systemic issues. I think, though, Gemma, the note I would like to end on really is that moral imperative one that you're highlighting. You know, we're not just recording what's happening here. We are saying and highlighting, here is research that's been done that shows this, and we need to carry on tracking the system. So at Belmas, we run a research interest group that was called Structural Reform. And we were surprised that fewer and fewer people were attending it. People said, oh, well, it's the name. You see, the structural reform has happened. So we're going to call it institutional reform or organisational reform. They're having a conversation at the moment about what they actually call it. I think it's currently called institutional, but they're moving to organisational. And it's because 85% of our system in an English context has moved across. So the structural reform has happened. That doesn't mean everybody should get a free pass and it should just operate on this, you know, way where we're still having those big gaps in learning outcomes, educational opportunities, and, you know, the poly crisis that you've really well highlighted to us today. So it is about that moral imperative, isn't it? Us as researchers, us as policy, you know, policy advisors wanting to try and steer and influence the agenda to some good, really.
Can I just add very briefly, Laura? I think that's a very telling question. What can you learn from other researchers? What can other researchers actually hand on? Because I think quite often we kind of get in either, well, my experience of the literature is that there's a lot of literature which is kind of very critical at the broad level, but it doesn't actually help you think tactics at the lower level. And I think there is something about what is going on in our system, the fight over evidence. Now, normally that ends up being polarized. You know, there are people who say, well, let's have RCTs, you know, let's have the kind of evidence that you can build from a data-rich system, which the English system is. You know, we track pupil data obsessively, and we have lots of stuff, researchers who therefore do quant research on that. And in the international arena, the kind of critical policy sociologists who track OECD advice. There's a lot of kind of high level theoretical thinking. My sense is that it doesn't get in at the tactical level, and that business about not sufficiently evaluating and not clarifying what goes on. Oddly enough, the people who are evaluating the system most intensely over here are government agencies. So the National Audit Office has written very critical report on the Education Endowment Foundation, saying basically you cannot show value for money because where are the gaps closed? All right. And there have been critical reports on, I'm thinking of the work of Bernie Munoz-Shiro, who is in DLL and CEL, on stuck schools that she did with Melanie Aaron. There simply is not the evidence that the claims the champions of the way things run make. It's not reliable evidence. But that also then brings me back to something else, which I am increasingly seeing, and that is that a lot of what goes on in policy doesn't actually depend upon the evidence. Nobody really reads the evidence. What they do listen to are stories. And the one real vulnerability in the system at the moment here in the UK is actually around SEND, because we have a crisis in the increasing diagnosis of pupils with SEND. The strongest predictor of persistent absence, I know this from a very reliable colleague who's done some work on this area, the strongest predictor of persistent absence in our system is SEND. All right, so it's not parents keeping kids at home because they're taking them on holiday or can't be bothered. It is kids we send who do not fit the current system, who parents are agreeing to keep home, or, you know, that they can't persuade the kid to get into school. So there is evidence out there, but the extent to which it gets heard depends upon the narrative. And actually, the biggest thing that's making that narrative, that's getting it traction in policy and media world at the moment, is send parents jumping up and down and saying this is not working, and in some cases threatening court cases, you know, or kind of mobilizing in that kind of sphere. So I think that kind of, yes, we need better evidence, but the evidence in itself may not make the case. We also need stronger narratives. What do we want from school? We need a stronger articulation of that brings into the room what parents who are barely getting by in a cost of living crisis need from their school, so that we can redefine the value of school as a community hub in a way that Deborah is just highlighting has got lost. Why should I do this? You know, I'm running a business, I can't make it work. I'm not saying we'll get success that way, but it strikes me that we need to be paying attention to both the narrative and the evidence. We can't rely on the evidence alone. Drives me nuts, actually.
But that's
in
a
a rational world.
That's a terrific note for us to end on, though, Gemma, because it's that plea, isn't it, actually, to the research community out there to tell a better narrative, to try and have that influence. Because if you can't have an influence at a point like this, you know, a year into a new government that wanted to tackle these issues, and yet on the ground we're not yet seeing that response because those structures are still in existence, as you've both outlined very well this afternoon, then we're not moving and changing the agenda that actually people possibly think we are, and there isn't the evidence of that at the moment at all. So it will be interesting for us all to watch this space, but hopefully to carry on continuing influencing it as well. Thank you very much, Gemma. Thank you very much, Alice. We're really grateful. If you're watching our recording and you want to drop a line into the office to engage with us, it's info@belmas.org.uk. Look forward to hearing from you. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.